Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. My apologies to you for being late on the conference. The board meeting went longer today than we'd anticipated, in large part because of our concerns for three key issues that were being reviewed and decided upon this morning. One of them is to establish for the first time a new standard for our registration process. This is a standard of retention rate. It puts a requirement on the schools that there must be a retention of pupils exceeding the 90% rate, or else they must provide for us a plan for increasing the retention rate, and their registration will be subject to a review and approval of that plan, and then, of course, the results from that plan. We already have a registration requirement that in each school there must be a rate of completing successfully the Regents competency exam requirement at 85%. And now with the retention rate, which has to do with the holding power of the school all the way through completion of the diploma, we have, I think, an additional strong standard for registration. The board this morning has also been reviewing the matter of our regulations for children with limited English proficiency. And the third item that we have been discussing is the very important recommendations that have just been made by the President on further reductions in federal funding. Our deep concern with the President's recommendations, which will cut funding for federal programs in our state and across the nation, not at the rate of 12%, which is the rate that in fact is being used in the statement, but it's in fact a cut from the 1981 to the 1982 levels at more than 25%. Because when the President proposed that there be a 12% reduction, he was taking 12% from his own proposals of March. If you compare the President's latest recommendation of reductions with what the Congress approved at the end of July and the President signed, the President, in fact, is now asking for 27% less. That's not 12%. That's 27% less. For our state in the elementary and secondary education area, if you contrast the expenditures this year with what we would get next year, that's a cut of $200 million in elementary and secondary education. And our estimates, pardon?
200 million out of what?
200 million, our base last year was 780 million. From last year to this, we've already lost some 90 million. And now we're looking at recommendation by the President to cut it down even 200 more.
What would this mean? Obviously, it sounds as if you'll have to dismantle the department or something, but in your terms, could you sum up what the problems would be?
The problems, of course, will be in each and every school district all the way across the state. This means reductions in programs for children with handicapping conditions, a 33% reduction, I believe, targeted there. It means reductions in the programs of Title I, children who need compensatory education. A reduction there would be more than some 27%. In the aggregate, to look at it in terms of personnel, professionals and paraprofessionals in all the school districts, this would probably mean a reduction of more than 18,000 personnel.
18,000 jobs statewide.
That's right.
You say this $780 million base for elementary and secondary
That's
education.
right.
Defense. What's the total spending in New York State now on elementary and secondary education?
Total spending is approximately $10 billion.
So this is less than $1 billion on each end, right?
That's correct.
Commissioner, on this retention standard, if I could, why is it necessary, and what is it that some schools are doing or not doing that makes it mandated at 90% level?
Well, we think it's important to have this requirement for retention rate as a companion part to our requirement for the competency testing program. For this reason, we want to be certain that the schools are expending all the efforts they can to make certain that all students are encouraged and have the full opportunity to complete their high school program all the way through the diploma. Our concern is that with the other competency testing requirement, since that's a ratio of students who begin the 12th grade with those who complete the competency testing program, our concern is there might be an inclination for discouraging students from continuing. You would get a higher rate, you see, on the competency test if you had fewer students who started and stayed in through the 12th grade. We don't want that to happen. I don't think it's going to happen, but we're going to assure it doesn't happen by way of putting in the retention rate requirement.
Is there any indication that that has happened in any schools so far?
No, there isn't.
So why, if there's no indication that it has happened, why are you doing it?
Well, we're doing it because we want to make certain it doesn't happen, that there is not any kind of an incentive to work the wrong way. And beyond that, we have a very deep concern that in some of our schools in the state, we have now a very, very poor retention rate. We've got retention rates that may be down around the 42%. I'm sorry, the dropout rate at that, the retention rate would be the reverse of that. And we've got to do things to be sure that the holding power of the schools is increased. So it's not just the matter of combining it with the competency testing requirement, it's beyond that.
On the registration question as a whole, how many schools in the last year, for instance, did you deny registration to? Or have you denied any?
The process that we have on registration is that we're trying to register and review more than 200 schools a year, 200 of the high schools, both public and non-public. The process that we have provides that where there may be difficulties with compliance, rather than an immediate deregistration, we go through a review with the school, setting up a plan for correcting the deficiency, and then work with the school and with the school district in order to try to make certain that they're up over the standard of registration. During the course of this past year, we have not, therefore, actually deregistered any of the schools. The previous year, we denied registration to several schools and then worked with them on plans to attain the registration status. But in the course of the reviews just this past year, we have not officially removed the registration from any school. We have a number of the schools that we reviewed which are still on pending status. Means that there has been some deficiencies being corrected, some part of a plan which is underway.
Where does that money come from? The local school districts that for correcting whatever problems they decided upon. One of the criticisms of this plan has been, who's going to pay for this? That maybe the state ought to come up with the money and solve this problem.
The state has. The state's come up with funds in the form of regular state aid to the public schools. It's come up with funds which are targeted on children who have special needs because they may be economically or educationally disadvantaged. Come up with funds targeted on children who are handicapped, and so on. Had a very substantial increase in state aid last year, and of course it's the matter of pulling together those state resources, the federal resources and the local resources to make the corrections. It's not a question of having a special appropriation just for corrections on registration. It's a matter of the total effect of what funds are available. But there's an obligation in our state, and there has been an obligation on the local school districts to provide for education at the secondary level in registered schools, and we're making certain that that obligation is met.
But it is going to cost them money, right? They're going to have to come up with some money to institute for their detention programs. They're not going to be cheap to do.
That's right. That's right.
In other words, they're going to have to rearrange their spending somehow.
They may, They may. As I've indicated, we've advanced, I think, very substantial recommendations in the last year on what should happen by way of state assistance. We're getting ready to advance our recommendations for next year on state aid to the schools, and we are going to be thinking about the requirements we have for registration, the other demands on the schools, as we're building those recommendations. We've strongly taken the stance that the state ought to be increasing its share of the total of the cost of elementary and secondary education, and it's through that general approach that I think we meet the state obligation in being certain that registration standards are met.
But Governor Carey apparently gets tough policy though fiscally on the State Department. He's telling everybody to hold down expenses.
That's right.
How much anticipation is there on your part that you'll get any additional funding next year?
Well, I can't say with any accuracy just what we might receive next year. I simply would go back and point out the track record for the last 3 years. In circumstances where our state has been in difficult fiscal times, where we have advanced recommendations both through the governor and the legislature. The governor has consistently come in with quite low recommendations on increases in aid. The legislature has consistently come in with substantial increases. In each of those 3 years, an increase of something on the magnitude of $300 million or more. I believe that the legislative commitment to the state role in education is one that's certainly going to continue this next year. Our job, of course, is to advance the best judgments we can make as to what that commitment should be.
How much of that federal cutback might be taken up by the state, do you think? You're talking, you said earlier, $200 million if the newest proposals from the president come to pass. Or come to fruition.
And that figure, may I emphasize, of $200 million is the difference between what would be expected, what is being received now for this school year, and what would be available next school year. That $200 million is not a cut in this school year.
Mm-hmm.
We've already taken the $90 million cut from last school year to this. The 200 figure is from this one to the next.
So on top of the 90.
Right, on top of the 90.
Could the state be expected to pick up some of that slack, or do you think that would be impossible?
Well, our first step, of course, is to do everything that we possibly can to persuade the Congress not to accept that level of reduction. And I'm optimistic there. I've given as an example the fact that the President back in March went to the Congress at that time with a reduction which was around the magnitude of 20 to 25%. Congress didn't buy it. In July and in August, when the Congress acted, it approved reductions in spending which were far less than that. Their reductions were down around the 9 to 10% level. And I'm optimistic that as the statements can be made, as the impact of what's proposed by the President is presented to the Congress, that the Congress is going to be responsive on this. That they're going to see that if we're to have an economic recovery program in this country, indeed even in the President's terms, if the focus is going to be on improving business and industry and opening up private sector employment, there have got to be people who are trained and skilled to be able to take those jobs. That means you've got to have educational expenditures to get there.
Commissioner, what's your thought on the administration's commitment or lack of commitment to education? And you saw the speech last night. The
Well,
Department of Education, the Department of Energy, generally, what are your thoughts?
Well, the President has said repeatedly that he was going to propose that there be a change in the structure of education management at the federal level. Before he was elected, he campaigned on the proposal that he would abolish or alter the form of the Department of Education. So he's being consistent with those representations, as he said last night, that he wants to change the form of it. I don't know exactly what form he's thinking about right now. That wasn't revealed in the speech. The changeover in the structure of the department is one that I have opposed. I think it's extremely important that we continue to have a presence, a person who sits at the cabinet level with the president to deal with educational issues, and that's what cabinet or department status is all about. I think that the representations of the president in the unequal reductions back in March on education programs displayed to me a view that perhaps the federal government ought to be moving out of aid to elementary and secondary education. I think that's the wrong way to go. I think that we've got to be certain that the federal government keeps a commitment in aiding elementary and secondary education. It's had it, I might note, since the founding of the country when they set aside land under the Northwest Ordinances. And we've had that kind of a commitment all the way through, and I think it ought to be maintained. Unfortunately, I do see too many signals in Washington from the administration of a desire to very substantially cut out the federal government from a role in elementary and secondary education. That's what we see in that speech of last night, and that's what we're going to work to blunt.
Commissioner, the new bilingual regulations that the Regents passed this morning, some school districts are complaining that it removes their flexibility, particularly in these hard financial times. What's your response to that?
Our regulations are, of course, related to the appropriation which was enacted by the state legislature last March. We urged the state legislature to have a weighting of funds for pupils with limited English proficiency, and they responded. Not as much as we had proposed, but nevertheless they responded. In administering this program for this year, we want to be certain that standards are met by way of the provision of services for these children, whether it be in a bilingual program or whether it be in an English as a second language program or a combination of the two. What we found as we've been working on implementation is that in certain districts where there may be a court order or maybe a consent decree already in place, that the specifics of our regulations were somewhat different from the provisions of that court order or decree. We do not want to over-regulate, overload by way of exact compliance. We want to get the net effect of good services for these children. And so what we did this morning is propose, and the board accepted, a provision of the regs that means that where there is such a court order or a decree, if it's substantially equivalent to what we have in the regulations, then that will be sufficient as standards for this year. We've also provided some flexibility for those districts that are working toward fully approvable programs but aren't quite there and won't be there unless they get the state money. We don't want to put those districts in a catch-22 that they've got a plan to realize compliance, but the plan requires the state money, and yet we wouldn't authorize the state money until they were fully in compliance. We want a system so that we can work through this year and be certain that they get on board with the program.
But don't these regulations apply to all school districts that would be offering bilingual programs?
Oh, yes,
and
they
not
do.
just those competing for the state funds?
No. This is no longer a competitive grant program. This is now a program which provides that on the basis of the count of children who are limited English proficiency, there is an automatic appropriation if they have an approvable program. So you don't have a competitive grant arrangement here anymore.
Richard, to get back to the retention question for a minute.
Right.
Was this a unanimous ruling by the regent?
There were some amendments proposed to the recommendation that we made. The two amendments failed. The final vote that was taken on it, I believe, had a split. 2 abstentions, was it? All members voting for except 2 who were abstaining. There were no negative votes, if I remember correctly.
What is the retention, the average retention rate for all schools in the state at the moment?
I can't give you a single figure on that in the context of these standards that we've established. And the reason is that in order to make a calculation of each school's retention rate on the basis of this standard, not on what we usually talk about by way of dropout rate, but on this standard, we have to review with each school figures that we do not have for all schools right now. And this would include the figures about transfers in and out during the course of the years between the time there's entry of the 9th grade and the 12th year.
Well, shouldn't you have gone out and gotten those figures before you set
Well,
some standards?
we indeed have those figures for the sampling of districts that we were checking.
Well, the sampling then, okay, you give us the average from the sampling.
I can ask one of my colleagues if he's here. If he's not here, we'll get an answer for you immediately after that on, Jerry, is John here? We have it on the sampling. Again, the reason for not having it on each and every school is that you've got to get, for this measure, the net inflow and outflow on admissions through the course of the middle years. But we're very confident that on the basis of that sample, we've got a 20% sample, and that's going to give a good reflection of what the statewide figure would be. We do know this, that, and I think this is what's most important, that using the 90% figure, that approximately 75% of the high schools will be above the 90% figure, and that approximately 25% will be below. Then you have that important range between 90 and 88%, where there are about 13% of the schools, 12 to 13% of the schools. And in that range, note, if they are below the 90, but if in fact their pattern for the past 3 years has been a positive pattern, then they would not be required to provide for the special plan. The schools that we're targeting most on here are, of course, those that would be below the 88%, and we're talking then about approximately 12 to 13% of the schools. And for those schools, that would be where we would focus our review. That's where we think we should concentrate on providing the help and the pressure of standards to enhance the rate.
How many total state high schools, public and private?
Approximately 1,200.
Commissioner, with the increasing cuts on the federal level, I'm wondering, in your opinion, if the quality of education is to be maintained, okay, in this state and other states, I suppose, what does all this say to the property owner, the taxpayer, and the school district? I mean, it's going to have to come down the line sooner or later if the quality is to be kept up to where you think and school officials think it should be.
What's most disappointing to me about the present mood in the administration in Washington on these reductions in education is that the results of the programs which we have had, federal programs and state programs, especially focused on children with special needs, have shown that we're improving performance. Our test scores through this state are going up. I'm optimistic that we're going to soon be seeing results that the SAT scores are going to go up, which means that not only the elementary level, but the secondary level, we've got good news by way of performance. That's happened because of the commitment of these federal and state resources. The bottom drops out on these federal programs. I'm afraid that what we're going to see is a drop-off on those performance ratings. Thank you very kindly.
Thank you.